So welcome to Talk Wildlife, and my guest today, I'm delighted to have James with me. James Kendall from Woodland Classroom. I've just started a tree course he's doing. It's fantastic, and I thought the best thing to do was to have a chat with him, get him to introduce a few trees and introduce the course. Hiya James, how are you?
I'm very well, Alan. Thanks for having me. It's nice to be here. Obviously, I'm in my own home, but be here digitally. But lovely to be here, and glad you're enjoying the course as well.
The course is amazing. It really is amazing, and I highly recommend it. Although I did say that we wouldn't do an advert for the course, it's a fantastic course. It really, really is. But let's not go straight to the course. Let's talk about trees first of all. So my first question is, what makes a tree? So what differentiates a tree from a bush? Where's the line between the two?
Okay, well, the difference between, I'll backstep a little bit, the difference between a tree and a plant is that a tree puts on woody material and it creates that wood and it has that structure to it, that strength there, whereas plants don't know that they have their green stems, don't they? But if we're talking about the difference between a tree and a shrub or a bush, that's more interesting because shrub is a word we use a lot, but it's not a classification. You can't say, oh, this is a shrub. Something can have shrubby growth. It's more of a kind of colloquialism to say, oh, it's a shrubby tree. But a hazel is often shrubby, but it's as much a tree as an oak is. A Guelder rose is classed as a tree, but it's a very bushy shrub. It's putting on that woody material. So using the word shrub can be complicated. There's no such thing as a shrub specifically, but things can have a shrubby growth, or you can get smaller trees which are more bushy in their appearance.
Right, yeah, because you see hedges, and I think a lot of people automatically, unless you see a big tree like an oak sort of within the hedge, somebody would look at a hedge and go, it's a load of bushes with a tree in it. But obviously it isn't, because it's made up of things like blackthorn and hawthorn and various things like that, which is why I asked the question. So is, for instance, is an ivy classed as a tree? Is a holly classed as a tree?
A holly is definitely a tree. Ivy is an interesting one, isn't it? Because it's very much putting on woody material, but it's not freestanding, it's a climber. So I guess we could say also a tree has to be freestanding on its own as well, whereas the ivy is a climber. It uses other structures, whether that's a building or, of course, traditionally a tree, to climb up and reach the light. So there is that other kind of thing as well. You've got the woody material and the fact that it's a freestanding living structure as well.
Right, well, given we're talking about trees and we're talking about ivy, and all right, we've got a little bit of a differentiator now. We now know what a tree and a bush and shrub is, so that's great. Now then, ivy. You walk through the woodlands and you see a lot of ivy growing on trees. The sort of jury seems to be out, and there seems to be two different sort of thoughts as to whether the ivy damages the tree. What's your opinion on that?
Well, it's interesting, and I think you'll probably be in my camp, Alan, because you'll know how good ivy is for wildlife. It's fantastic. It has so many benefits. It's got the late berries, which are a great food for wildlife, and it's a nectar source as well with all the flowers it has, and it's fantastic nesting habitat as well for birds, and for bat roosts as well can often be in ivy. Does ivy harm a tree? This is an interesting question. Not intentionally, no. I love ivy, and generally I would keep it wherever it is, where I could. What ivy does, it doesn't strangle a tree as people think. It doesn't clamp onto it and squeeze the life out of a tree. It's just using the tree as a structure to grow up to reach the light so it can do what it needs to do as a living thing. The problem comes actually from us. It's nothing to do with wildlife. We've introduced a problem because when the ivy grows up a tree, if it's a mature tree and that tree has dead branches in it, if it's covered in ivy, that dead branch suddenly has a load of extra weight on it. With all the weight of the ivy, its wood and its leaves. And so that can weaken that dead branch, and it means it can fall off. and that can create a hazard in somewhere like a park or on a roadside or in someone's garden. So we are saying that's a hazard, that's a problem, when actually that's just nature. That dead wood falls to the ground, and of course that becomes food for all kinds of fungi, invertebrates, and extra habitat for the woodland. So the ivy isn't doing anything there. It's not intentionally hurting the tree. The other thing that ivy can do, if a tree is weak, think of the ivy with all that extra weight, all the extra leaves, and in winter, broadleaf trees drop their leaves. And one of the reasons they do this is to reduce the amount of sail factor that you get in a tree, the amount that the wind can blow it. And if we think of the November winds, we've had those this month when we're filming now, those strong winds that come through and really blow the leaves out. And throughout winter, with those strong winds, storms, if you had the leaves on the tree, it's more likely the tree would blow over in those strong winds. We don't tend to get them so much in the spring, summer, when the leaves are at their best. But when you factor ivy in, if you've got a tree that's already a little bit weak, you've got all that weight and all those leaves are acting like little sails catching the wind, and that can actually pull a tree down. Again, the ivy hasn't done it intentionally. It can just happen. And of course, naturally in woodland, that's great because a tree falls down, bang, creates a clearing. You get then all nice wildflowers coming up, and it's an opening in the canopy for new young trees to come through. So that's just part of ecology, really, part of succession, and part of how one of the only ways clearings can be created in high forest, really. So ivy's great. The only problem is when people come into contact with it, and we maybe park our car under this ancient oak tree which is covered in ivy, and we don't want it to get flattened. So that's where the conflict comes in. So ivy's fantastic, but there is a bit of a conflict with people. But generally, love it. Ivy's great stuff. Right,
and is it actually competing for nutrients with the tree, given that it's growing in such close proximity?
No, it's not. It's not like a parasite or a symbiote, something like you get with mistletoe, which actually puts its roots into the tree and takes some of the nutrients out of it. No, ivy doesn't do that at all. All its nutrients come from the soil, so it has its own roots, which is why if people want to manage ivy, you see them, they'll cut it off round the tree, and all the ivy will die up in the canopy because it needs to be connected to the floor. It's not taking anything from the tree, except maybe competing a little bit with its leaves, but generally the tree will adapt and it will send further branches out accordingly. Yeah.
Right, and you mentioned mistletoe, so a quick question about mistletoe. Mistletoe, fascinating stuff. It's much more than just something you kiss under it's Christmas. You said mistletoe does actually put its roots into the tree, so it's parasitizing the tree. Is it linked to a specific tree or specific trees, or is it general? Because you don't see a lot of it.
You do see more of it in some parts of the country and others, and that's because it's like certain trees. It likes apple trees, and I'm pretty sure it likes poplars as well, which we don't have a lot of around where I am. I'm in northeast Wales. I'm pretty sure it's linked to poplars as well, but apple trees it particularly likes, which is why often you can get in an orchard, you can get a crop of apples, and then if you've got mistletoe in, you get another crop there in December, and there's a bit of bio-cropping there, two kind of harvests for the farmer there. But yeah, it doesn't like a lot of trees. There's a lot of trees it doesn't like, and that's why back in ancient history, if you found mistletoe on the oak, and the ancient Druids were harvesting that was very special, because it rarely grows on the oak. So if it was found there, it was a very special thing. It was harvested with a golden sickle. So that's where that kind of mystery and mysticism comes from, the oak being associated with the mistletoe there. But yeah, apple trees, and I'm pretty sure poplars. I would have to check it.
Right. Okay. Well, since you've brought up ancient, let's talk ancient. Let's talk about trees that are native, trees that are non-native. First of all, I mean, obviously we had an ice age. So presumably during the ice age, there wasn't that many trees left. I mean, clearly I'm exaggerating to make a point, but species-wise, we then would have had a, if you like, recolonization of parts of the UK. We're not talking Europe. We're out of Europe now. They can keep their trees. We'll have our trees. But so UK, we don't have that many native trees. Why is that? And give us an example of some of the trees that people might think are native trees that actually aren't.
That's interesting. Okay, yeah. So we don't have many native trees in the grand scheme of things. There is a bit of debate as to exactly how many native trees we have. The number 32 is often cited. I've seen lists go anywhere up to about 50, depending on who you speak to. But yeah, generally around 32 to 45, 50 to 50 might be slightly pushing it. But yeah, it's not many, because as soon as you go on the continent, you've got at least a couple of hundred. So in terms of tree identification, we're onto a bit of a winner here in the UK and Ireland, because we've got a lot less to deal with, certainly out in the countryside anyway. So the reason why is because of, you've hinted on it, the Ice Age, and the trees that managed to cross the land bridge when we were connected to the continent before, we severed, and we've got now the English Channel. So those trees that made it across are still here now, and they've been the ones that have been here now for thousands of years. So we don't have that many in the grand scheme of things. But of course, one of the first trees to come across to this country was the birch, that pioneer tree, which makes up so much of the boreal forest as well. And birch are pioneers. They're one of the first to come into scrub land. If land is left in this country, it wants to basically become high oak forest. Unless you're right on the coast, on a beach, or whether you're right up on the highlands or in a bog, everything else wants to be high oak forest in this country. The first trees to come in to create that are the birch. They're spread by wind dispersal. They have very small, tiny seeds that travel a long way. So they go out into the environment and they seed prolifically. And if you've been to any areas which have been let go, or going back to nature, you'll see the birch trees and the willow really proliferating there, doing very well. And then as they start to create a young woodland, then you can get some of the longer lived species in, things like your oaks and ashes and all of those coming in. And birch trees don't have a long lifespan at all, kind of around 80 to 120 years. That's not long in the lifespan of a tree, and they come down, and then you've got the much longer lived oaks taking over time. But the birch get in there and they drop a lot of leaf litter each year, and that improves the woodland soil. And as they die off, that's creating deadwood, which is, of course, improving that woodland soil. And the value of ancient woodland really is in the soil itself. And that's why when you get a plantation on ancient woodlands, you might get some conifer trees, that can still have a good wildlife value to it, especially if you're trying to eventually convert that to broadleaf woodland over time, because that value of the soil could still be there, and all it needs is the right conditions for those seeds to come up. But you're asking, I'm getting off point, you're asking about native trees, non-native trees, and naturalized trees. The thing is, although we only have kind of a handful in the grand scheme of things of true natives, we have hundreds of species of trees, probably, I would dare to say maybe thousands or so species of tree in this country, because of course we have cultivars, we have all the exotic trees that we brought in from all different parts of the world in the last few hundred years. So there are non-natives. One of the most obvious non-natives would be a lot of the conifers that you see in conifer plantations planted by the Forestry Commission since the kind of 1920s in big numbers onwards. So things like your Sitka spruce, your Norway spruce, so the clue's in the name there as to where it's from. Yep. All those kinds of trees. The larch as well is one that you see a lot over here in Wales, but it's not native. So those are your non-natives. But then there are those common trees that are naturalized that, as you suggested, people might think they're native, but they're not. And those are trees which have been here for quite a while, a little bit longer than those that are classed as simply non-native, and have found their place in the landscape. So they're not classed to be invasive species that would take over. They've kind of found their place. And the three most obvious examples of those that people might think are native trees are the horse chestnut, so conker tree, the sweet chestnut, which of course has roasted chestnuts on open fire, and the sycamore. There's a bit of debate as to whether the sycamore is invasive or not. It is quite prolific, and when it gets into a woodland, it can really go for it. Some people would say to the detriment of other native species, so it might need a bit of managing, but it's not invasive in the fact like rhododendron, which will just swamp an area. Yeah. So sycamore, horse chestnut, sweet chestnut. Sycamore and horse chestnut were introduced, we think, around the 1700s, where sweet chestnut is thought to be introduced by the Romans, although that is up to debate as well. There is thought it was introduced a little bit later, and they brought it for the fantastic timber and for the nuts as well, which are great food, a great food source.
Right. Okay, and horse chestnut and sweet chestnut not related?
Not at all, no. That's the difference. So now we come on to kind of the difference between common names and Latin names where they can be useful to us. So you've got horse chestnut, sweet chestnut, very similar common names, but the Latin names, horse chestnut has got one of the most convoluted Latin names, Aesculus hippocastanum, I'm pretty sure, with the horse chestnut, whereas the sweet chestnut is totally different. Castanea sativa, I think it is, off the top of my head. You can fact check that one for me, Alan, because I'm on the spot right now.
The space is not arguing.
But the point is, look at the Latin names, and they're very different, which tells you they're not related. But they're both chestnuts because they both produce like what we know as conker-like nuts in that spiky case. So there's similarity there, but they are not related whatsoever. Whereas sweet chestnut is fantastic timber for all kinds of projects. Horse chestnut is terrible timber for building with. Nobody uses it for anything much at all, structurally or anything outdoors. It's not good stuff, really. But a beautiful tree in its own right. A tree shouldn't just be valued just because we can do something with it.
Absolutely
it's
not.
A beautiful tree on its own. And horse chestnuts, when they get old, have fantastic bark, lovely twist to them, full of character.
Right, you mentioned ancient earlier on. So I just want to sort of, because there's a lot of talk at the moment about ancient woodland being ripped down because we're building a railway that nobody wants and all of this lot. What constitutes an ancient woodland or an ancient tree?
Okay, so ancient woodland, people love to classify things and nature doesn't really want to be classified. But we love to do it and it helps us understand what's going on as well. So with ancient woodland, that is a woodland site which is still forested, which has been woodland since the first official maps were made, which is around the 1600s mark. If a woodland was woodland on those early maps, then we can pretty much assume that it was woodland back into the past as well, before we really start doing even more clearing as we've done in the last few hundred years. So if it stayed forested since around the 1600 mark when we had those first maps, it's still classed as ancient woodland. We do have plantation on ancient woodland sites, what's known as PAWS, P-A-W-S, and that's where you have an ancient woodland site which has since been cut down, deforested, but conifer trees have been planted back on it pretty quickly. So you've still got a bit of a canopy there. There would have been a gap, but the value of the ancient woodland soil is still partially there. So you still get interesting fungi coming up. You might still have a few large veterans of oaks or other trees still hanging on in there that they didn't take down. So there's a lot of those, and that's where a lot of woodland restoration projects are happening. Organisations like the Woodland Trust doing PAWS restoration, where they're slowly bringing those conifer plantations back to a native broadleaf mix. In terms of what makes an ancient tree, there is no number. You can't say this tree is this age, so it is an ancient or veteran tree, because it depends on the species of tree, because some trees live longer than others. So what constitutes an ancient birch is not the same as what constitutes an ancient oak, because a birch lives a lot less than an oak does. But when an oak gets past a couple of hundred years, it starts to become a tree of note. You know, it starts to build up its value, really. But when an oak really becomes amazing for wildlife is when it starts to die. They say an oak tree, as a general rule, takes 300 years to grow, 300 years living, and 300 years to die. And it's in those last 300 years when it starts to rot. You get all this interesting fungi start to be associated with it. You get all the kind of epiphytes and other plants all growing all over it, that its value for wildlife just goes up like this, you know. And they're just beautiful specimens. So an ancient tree or a veteran tree depends on the species of tree. If you're in an upland, for instance, you can have an ancient tree, like an ancient hawthorn, which is actually very small because it's been stunted. Because it's in the uplands, it takes longer to put any weight on because it's colder conditions, it's got the wind buffeting it. But if you were to cut it down, you'd see that the growth rings are very close together. So it's a lot older than it may look. So yeah, that's ancient and veteran trees on trees of note. It's quite a flexible thing. But there's a great resource actually on the Woodland Trust website. They have a map of a project they've been doing where they've been mapping a lot of ancient or veteran or notable trees across the country. It's a citizen science thing, and they have a team that go in and then check this afterwards, and people are really mapping these. So you can have a look at the variety of what's out there, and if you think you might have an ancient tree or a veteran tree, or even a tree that's an oak that's a couple of hundred years old that you want on the map there, you can do that, and you can get involved. So yeah, interesting project. So yeah, that's what's going on with that.
That's brilliant. I'll put a link to that underneath the video on YouTube.
Brilliant.
I'm sure people will be very interested in that. So let's bring us up to date now. So identifying trees. I've mentioned the course. It is very, very good. But you've started it, you've launched it now, so coming into winter. And in the actual course itself, you actually reference and say it's worth, even if you're doing it, if you've started the course in spring, it's still worth looking at the winter videos. Why is starting tree identification in winter the way to go?
I think, have you heard the phrase, like, when you get up in the morning, swallow the frog? And the idea of that is, who wants to swallow a frog? No one. It sounds awful. What they say is, do the thing you need to get out of the way first, get it done, and the rest of the day you can crack on with whatever else needs doing. And I think when it comes to winter tree ID, when the leaves are gone, I think a lot of people are put off. Like, you know what, I'm comfortable with leaves. I can recognise leaves, and I'll wait till the spring and summer and look at them then. But if you tackle it head on and go, right, let's really start looking at these trees properly. And in winter, without the leaves, we're forced to look closer. It's really important to zone into what you're looking at and take some time with the tree. And because all those leaves are off, we get to look at those other details. We get to look at the buds, the bark, the bud structure, the leaf litter on the floor, which can be useful. The form of the tree can be useful in some of the trees. And we're forced to make a closer look. And by starting in winter, if you get good at that, that's going to inform your tree identification throughout the rest of the year. If you can identify a tree in winter, identifying it in the summer is an absolute doddle, because a lot of those features are still there. So features on the twig are still there in summer. The bark is still there in summer. Something like wild cherry. If you think about that tree, we could talk about the leaves, but you know what? If I was to pick out one key feature, I'd say, look at the bark of wild cherry. Once you know that bark, you've got it all year round. Look at the bark, it's there. So, that can be really useful. We're looking at the tree laid bare in its skeletal form, and we're forced to look closer. And that's no bad thing, because it puts us in the right mindset to really examine that species and get to know it. And I said, if you can do it in winter, not only is your confidence going to be hugely boosted going into spring and then summer, but you're also going to have laid some really good quality groundwork to understand what's going on between the different species that we have here.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think, people see a tree in the winter and think, by all intents and purposes, it's dead, it'll come back type of thing. Mm. What a lot of people don't realise, and I was one of these until quite recently, what a lot of people don't realise is that actually, the buds are already there, they're already starting to grow, they're already starting to form during winter. So there is a lot to look at, and of course then you've got catkins coming out, and you've got some of the pseudocones coming out and stuff like that. So, and you've also got the old growth, which helps. So this year's cones or dead leaf tell you so much about a tree. So I think you're right. Starting it in winter is actually it's helping me significantly, and did when I did the free version of the course, which will come onto the structure of the course in a second for people so that they can understand it. But you start off as well talking about three key principles that you should adhere to, for want of a better phrase, when you're starting to look at trees. Just tell us about the three key, it's very hard to say that, 3 key principles. Tell us about that.
Maybe I should change your title to something a bit more easy to say. Who knows? But yeah,
there you go.
Tree ID. There we go. Be your contribution, Alan. So the idea is to give people some easy rules that they can remember when they're approaching tree identification. And you could probably apply this to any kind of wildlife identification that you're doing to an extent. It would need a bit of adapting. There's 3 principles. The first one is tuning. So tuning into your environment. And I've touched on this a little bit already about getting in the right mindset. Because when I do tree ID, I see it as a little bit of an elimination game, a process of elimination. I like to ask, what is it not? And that's going to whittle down the list down to what it could be. So we go with, 40, 50 odd trees. It could be out in the countryside to about 3 or 4. And we can go, okay, great. Now we're in the zone and we can start to ask some real questions of the tree. So first, tune into your environment. So you go out for your country walk and you see a tree you don't recognize. Stop and slow down. And this idea really comes from tracking, because I'm involved in bushcraft. The idea of having to slow down and adopt the pace of nature. And this is where, you know, mindfulness comes into it as well. I'm really kind of thinking, okay, where am I? Am I out in farmland? Am I in a city park? Am I on a National Trust estate? If I'm in one of those places, what does that tell me about what kind of things will be here? Well, if I'm out in the countryside, it's probably most likely going to be only native species that I see. If I'm in a National Trust estate, they probably planted all kinds of exotics in the last couple of 100 years, and I'm probably going to see some interesting stuff here. If I'm in a town park, it's probably going to be species which can cope a bit more with pollution, ones that are there for ornamental reasons, exotics as well as some natives, but probably mostly exotics or cultivars. Now, I'm not asking people to know that list of species straight away. Okay, well, I'm going to see these things. But the more you do it, and the more you practice your tree identification, the more you'll start to zone in and think, okay, well, I'm in Norfolk. What trees am I going to see here? What trees are going to be in this wetter area, in flatter lands? I'm up in the Highlands of Scotland. I'm probably not going to see a beech tree right on the tops. So, you know, that kind of thing. You start to get used to that. So tuning in is really important because it makes you slow down. And especially with that winter tree ID, you're starting to look at the details. And especially if you've visited a site before, you think, okay, what have I seen here before? Okay, so tuning in, number one. The second one is begin with a branch. That's principle 2. And the idea of that is that when we approach a tree, it can be quite overwhelming, especially in winter. We think, oh, there's this whole tree. I've got no idea what it is. So zone it right down. Take the very end of a branch, a good healthy branch, and that branch will pretty much tell you everything you need to know about the tree, 90% of the time. There are other factors. We mentioned the wild cherry earlier, where you could just go straight to the bark. It's a wild cherry. But with most trees, you know, begin with a branch, because we are taking away the idea of looking at the whole tree straight away and narrowing it right down to a small part of the tree where we can ask some questions. Everything you need to know is there. There'll be buds, as you said, probably in good condition. There might be some catkins from winter. There might even be leaves. If it's something like an elder, which is the first tree to come into leaf in this country in January, you already get the young leaves. There's the twig colour. There might be spots on that twig. There might be hairs on the twig. There might be a little kind of surface of film you can scrape off. All these little ideal things. There might be, you'd be able to peel the bark off and it comes off in a string, like with elm. You go, this could be elm, or lime also does that. So that branch can tell you so much. And it also makes it much less intimidating for you to begin with a branch. Make sure, though, the branch is attached to the tree you want to look at, especially in a woodland. Yeah. I've done it myself, and I've seen students do it on my courses, is that they'll go, what tree is this? And they're looking at the branch, and actually it's attached to that one over there, not to the one they're looking at here. So make sure, follow it back, and make sure it's attached to the trunk and the bark that you're looking at. It's easily done. Okay, the third principle is a question, alternate or opposite. And that means, are the buds or leaves in summer arranged alternately on the branch or in opposite pairs? So let's start with winter. The buds on twigs are pretty much either on trees in opposites or alternate. So with an opposite, if you've got your branch, you've got 2, 4, 6, 8. Buds in opposite pairs, like you get with the ash tree or the horse chestnut that we mentioned earlier, the sycamore as well. In fact, all maples are in opposite pairs. If they're alternate, then you've got the branch and you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 climbing up the tree like this. That's alternate. The majority of tree species in this country are alternate. So straight away, if you look at that and you're seeing a tree that has buds in opposite pairs, you can immediately play that elimination game and rule out all those species that don't have opposite buds. And with opposite pairs, that's great because there are less species that have that. So that's really going to start to narrow down your list to about kind of 10, 12 native species that I can think off the top of my head that have opposite buds. If it's alternate, it's not as useful because you've got more to play with, but you can eliminate those opposite buds. And then we start to look at other details. And that's where in the course, I start to identify key features on the twig, the bud color, whether there's spots, whether there's hairs, a film, the twig color, all those kind of things. And we look at other details as well. So by zoning in and asking those 3 questions of the tree and looking at the branch, is it alternate or opposite, you're really starting to eliminate what the tree isn't, so you can decide what it is.
Excellent. Excellent.
Great.
And they are principles that I am definitely noting as I go out looking at my trees. But let's talk a little about the course.
Okay.
It's a massive, you know, I mean, I know the one that I'm doing, which is the pro version, has got 25 trees in it across 4 seasons. How long did it take you to put it together?
I started filming it over 2 years ago, and I thought, well, this would be a nice little thing to do. It might be a series of videos on YouTube, or maybe I'll make it into a little course. And then even though we've only got kind of 32 to 50 odd trees that will be included in the final course, it's massive, yeah. I didn't realize how big a job it would be. But also it's been so interesting as well, because it's made me look even closer at the trees that I already know and think, what are those key features that anybody could recognize? And it's very much been designed not from a botanist's point of view, because I'm not a botanist. I don't have a degree like that. So I try to use more layman's terms for things and make it more accessible for people, because I don't want to intimidate people. And that's part of the whole idea, really, is that it can be accessible to anyone who's just interested or passionate about trees, but walk out in the woods and think, you know what, I really would love to know what that is. I really love to know what that tree is and that tree is, and be able to, or maybe, you know, educators like yourself, Allan, that want to share that knowledge with others. That's why I've created it. But yeah, 2 years in the making at least, but lockdown has allowed me to finish it. Although it's an evolving project, there will be more trees added as time goes on. At the minute, as we film it now in November 2020, just the identifying trees in winter segment is open. But then in February next year, spring will launch with all the trees then. And then as the year goes on, we'll have summer and autumn. And then there'll be a whole load of trees on there for you to look at in all 4 seasons. I think that's important as well, because it would be easy just to do winter and summer and do the course like that. But there's so many interesting and defining things in spring or autumn for certain trees. Something like the spindle, which really hasn't got too much of interest in it to the passerby, you know, or something on a walk most times of the year. But then in autumn, it just explodes with fantastic colour, these fantastic kind of seeds, and the leaves go beautiful red. And so to not talk about it in autumn, I think would be a bit of a shame, and do the spindle some injustice, because that's its moment. Or with willows in spring, you know, they really melt into the background in winter. There's, you know, yeah, we can identify them. But in spring, they really come into their own with their catkins, and that makes them very different from the majority of other species that are out there. So it's really important to look at the whole year, because our seasons are so defined and so kind of iconic and built into our culture, that I think it's important to look at them throughout those 4 seasons. Yeah.
Yeah, and so the makeup of the course, really, it's based around sort of video, and it's also got some cheat sheets that you can run off, which are very good, and then take into the field with you. And you can also download that onto your phone or an app and take them with you, which is, it's great. You've also got sort of Facebook interactions, and you've got some workshops that you're running quarterly, which is great. But let's just talk about the structure. So as an entry point, I did part of the free course. I got partway through it, and then you did a talk for somebody on Zoom, and I was on it. And I asked you when it was coming up, and you said it was coming out soon. So I stopped the free one, waiting for the paid one. But that's just because I'm a completist and I like to do the whole thing. So what's the best entry point for somebody that's sort of thinking of getting into trees, and, you know, how should they approach the course? So first of all, what's the entry point? What would you suggest? And then how should they approach? So if they go from the free to the pro, how should they approach it?
Well, first of all, I should tell you the name of the course. That would be helpful, wouldn't it? It's called the Complete Tree ID course. That's the main course. And there are 3 tiers to that. But I'd recommend anybody to start with a free course. It's called Kickstart Your Tree ID Skills. And that's completely free to do. And it's 3 native trees. It's the ash, the hazel, and the field maple in all 4 seasons. So for free, you'll get an introductory segment where I talk about the 3 key principles and some other interesting stuff. And then you'll get all 3 trees in all 4 seasons with videos. You'll get the cheat sheets as well, such as this one for ash in autumn. So I printed them off and laminated them. But these cheat sheets, they basically highlight for you what the key principles are. So you can look at those and say, right, if I see these 4 things, it's an ash tree in autumn. And as Allan said as well, you can download these to your phone or your tablet, and that's really nice to take it out and about. So you've got a little reminder with you on there. So there's those for all 4 seasons. But yeah, that's a great entry point because first of all, it's free. And if you don't like it, no harm done. But if you do like it, there are paid levels of the course, which you've joined, Allan, which is great. And on there as well, on the free course, there are quizzes after each season to test your knowledge and just see if you soaked up all the information. But also there are photo galleries as well. So I've taken hundreds of photos of all the different trees at 4 times a year, both out on location, really zooming in on those details that I talk about in the video, but also in a little studio that I have. So you've got that nice and clean, you've got those twigs against a nice clean background. You can really see the shapes, and that's certainly true in the summer as well with the leaves as well. So lots of resources on there on the free course. So it's called Kickstart Your Tree ID Skills. It's free. I'm sure, Allan, you'll help people to find out where they can see
a link below. I keep pointing down there as if we're already there, but I'll put a link under the video on YouTube.
Yeah.
And
then the complete Tree ID course is where we start to get into the paid tiers of it. So there are 3 tiers of that. There's beginner, pro, and expert. Those titles don't reflect, oh, I have to take beginner, pro, and expert. It's not progressive. You can take any level you want. They simply reflect how much information is in each one. So the beginner has 15 trees, the pro has 25 trees, and the expert currently has 30. That's going to go up as time goes on, and the pro one might increase in size as well. But as you said, Allan, as well, the higher up you go up the tiers, the more of my time you get as well. So you get live interactive workshops through Zoom, like 1 per season, where we talk about what's going on that season, answer questions, talk about tree of the month, that kind of thing. But then also in the expert level, you can get one-to-one coaching. So we'll sit down over Zoom and really go through where you're at as a learner at this time, what I can help you with. We might do a session at the start and a session towards the end. It'll be up to you. Each learner wants support at different times. So there's that as well. Unlimited email support, got a question or a photo of a tree, send it to me, and we'll see what we can do to help. So yeah, that's how it works, but do check it out. And I've got an offer as well that I'm doing. So for anyone listening to this podcast, any Talk Wildlife listeners, if you use the coupon code Talk Wildlife, you'll get 10% off any of those 3 tiers. So that's my little thank you for listening to anyone listening out there. Thanks very much, and I hope you enjoy the course.
Cool. I'm going to cancel and rebook. And the quizzes you mentioned, really good. Apart from annoying when you get a question wrong, if you're like anything like me, it's like, oh no, when you beat yourself up. What I like about them is they highlight the bits you've missed. So when you're doing the quiz, if you get a question wrong, you know which bit you haven't actually fully got yet, and you can actually go back to it. It's a really useful little trick. You just, right, okay, so that's what I need to reinvestigate. So yeah, I quite like them, apart from when I get a question wrong. Always irks me.
Yeah, it's I must stress, it's not an exam. There's no pass or fail. For the Complete Tree ID course, there will be a certificate at the end when you've completed it, for those that want it, especially for those in the industry or students. But with the quizzes, you can take them as many times as you want. It's more to test your own knowledge rather than to say, oh, you failed. That's not what I'm about. I hate exams. Yeah, it's more to help you out, use it as a learning tool for sure. So yeah, I'm really glad you found that useful. That's great.
It is, and it's interesting that you mentioned sort of experts and sort of when you look at the course, I can see the course being useful at any level, to be honest. Yeah, it's really, really good for what I would call on my website newcomers, people that are just wanting to get into trees. Then with people that might have a little bit of knowledge, like I pretend I've got a little bit of knowledge, it's really useful because it really hones those skills. But I also think, anybody that is looking to do, get involved in tree surveying or anything like that, or even citizen science projects, it really, to me, I think what you've managed to do is cover the whole spectrum. Because it's really, really good. Let's put it this way. There's nothing else you can say about a beach that you haven't already said that is going to help somebody know that's a beach. it's really, really good, really involved. And that's where the 4 seasons come in. So yeah, I mean, I think just in case somebody's sort of pondering and thinking, yeah, but is it too advanced? Or at the other end of the scale, somebody's thinking, but is it too basic? It's not. It's across the board. It really does. It covers all the boundaries as far as I'm concerned.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, that's great. Great to hear. You know, when you put a lot of work into something, you put it out there and you hope it connects with people. So that's really good to hear. But I think it's interesting what you say, because even somebody who's maybe a bit of an expert in tree ID, or, you know, come at it from a botany point of view, would find it interesting, because the whole course is an exercise in interpreting trees to people who are new to it. So for someone who's looking to actually educate others about trees, they might find some real value in there, because I am talking about things in layman's terms. I'm talking about key features that anybody can recognize. So there's a real value there to anyone who wants to teach trees to others as well. And of course, as I said, there's all those guides which could be printed off and then used in your own teaching setting as well. So you could give these out to a group of kids or a group of adult learners. We say, we're going to go out and find these 5 trees today. Look for these and tell me what you find. So yeah, there is a value across the board. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, again, you know, I know we've not got that many trees, but it's when, you know, whenever somebody says to me, how do I get into birding? Or, you know, how do I become a bird watcher? What I always say is, look, well, start with a common. You know, start in your garden. Don't overwhelm yourself. Don't go out and buy the Collins Bird Guide that's this thick and got every European species in every plumage. Start with the basics. And, you know, I think that's a really good way of starting. So, you know, go out. You mentioned that there's thousands of trees in the country, but there's only a certain amount that are native. And the course narrows it down to the species that are native. And by doing that, it gives you that introduction. Because by doing the course, you're not only learning about those 25 trees, the one out of the course I'm doing, you're learning your key principles, what to look for in another tree. Because sometimes getting a book, and again, the Collins books, always good, but there's a lot in them.
It's funny you mentioned the Collins guide. I've got the Collins tree guide back there, and you could literally rip 2/3 of the pages out of it and it would still be just as useful as a guide. For most people, because as you said, you know, a lot of the trees that are in a lot of these guides you don't come across. The maidenhair tree, you know, great that it's in the guide, but I've never seen one. I'm sure there's plenty of them about, but you know, it's not as useful. And also, as you said, it can be intimidating. You know, let's start with the ones that are really common and are about, and let's learn the key principles. Let's get a good grounding, and then you can build from there. Like anything, get a good grounding in something, and then you go, okay, let's look in my local area. Let's go to the local National Trust property or to the country park. Let's start, you know, looking at some stuff we're not so familiar with. Now we understand what to look for. So yeah, that can, yeah, exactly the same with birding. I think that's interesting.
Yeah, great. Right. Well, we'll leave it there. I would really like at some point to, and what I want to do is maybe stall it to see if we're ever allowed out to play again. Because I'd really like to talk to you a lot more about trees, because the beginning part of this interview was, you know, talking about the trees, really interesting. I had so many more questions I could have asked, but, you know, we haven't really got 3/4 of a day. So at some stage, maybe we'll do that when we can get out to play again, if that's all right with you.
That sounds great, Alan. Yeah, it's been nice to be here, and yeah, thanks for inviting me. It's great to share this time with you and share time with somebody else who's really enthusiastic about wildlife and trees. So yeah, great to meet you.
Excellent. Thanks for your time, James.
Brilliant. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.